this summit has recognized the continuing need for real change over the years, and somehow, or as we move forward, this summit has continued to determine how we can do that to the benefit of our patients. So at the foundation of it, changing systems is what we're looking at. This is the foundation of all the work that we're doing. How do we change the system so it's more suitable for patients, whatever their case is. So today we're going to have the opportunity to hear from individuals who have been at the leading edge of change, and primarily in Indigenous communities, but their impacts go further than just Indigenous communities. So after the speakers have their opportunity, we will move into a Q&A session, which will give you a chance to kind of ask questions that you would like to ask. So moving on to Sheila, I know that Leah had given a bit of an introduction, and I just wanted to say the part that really impacts me about Sheila Cloutier. You know, aside from all the awards and the recognition she's won, I think the thing that hits me hardest is the great impact of her work, and I guess the great impact on Indigenous people around the world. So with that, I'm sure that you want us to get on to hearing from Sheila. So with that, I'll pass that on to Sheila. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. And so what I like to do is walk through these issues of where the Inuit have come from, not as a historian, but from even many of them have been lived experiences for me. You know, in 1920s, we were hunters, and we became fur traders almost overnight to meet the global market for fur. And then when the global collapse occurred with the global market of the fur, we were left alone to move into areas of starvation and famine. And everybody forgot about us when that collapse occurred. And the schools were built, and we were forced into communities. So there was less hunting on the land, as our land is our natural teacher, and that was replaced by institutional schooling. And yet that was another start of creating dependencies and diminishing our ability to act for ourselves and to think for ourselves. So the control was starting to come into our communities very quickly. More processed foods. We were moved into these little matchbox homes. And there were more historical traumas that were really starting to come in the 1960s. We were sent away for school at a very young age. I was 10 when I was sent away for school. 2 years with a family in Nova Scotia, 3 years in a residential setting where 200 of us Inuit children were sent from Nunavik and Nunavut across to Churchill, Manitoba, where we lived in these old military barracks for the entire year. The sexual and emotional and physical abuses started to happen from those in authority in the new institutions that were coming in to play. So that's when this onset of addictions and the violence and the suicides really started to set in, because it was a profound woundings of all of those historical traumas that really still today is the root cause of the problems that we face in the social and health arena. In the 1980s, we realized that we were being poisoned from afar. These persistent organic pollutants were making their way up through the weather patterns into our food chain. And we are avid eaters of marine mammals. And so here we were, being the net recipients of these toxins. And so we became very alarmed about this, and we became very outraged that it was not of our doing, but our mother's nursing milk was laden in high levels than anywhere else. We're realizing but the answers lie right at home. They lie in our culture. So we're finding that our culture is the medicine that we seek to be able to get back on our feet and not just be victims of all of these situations, but also to become the teachers of sustainability in this world, because we are still connected to our environment, to our climate, to our culture, to the land, and the well-being of all of that in a holistic way. Unsustainable waste causes irreparable damage to the atmosphere, and it's forcing the planet to react with violent storms and other erratic events. And this is not unlike the Indigenous children, the Inuit children, or anyone who's gone through and suffered trauma. Without care and a space to heal, an effective coping mechanism, self-destructive behavior, is inevitable. And what we see in our communities and in our atmosphere are not abnormal behaviors. In fact, what we're seeing are perfectly normal reactions to extremely abnormal circumstances. And so that connection of human trauma and planet trauma are one of the same. Our planet is a living, breathing entity. And what we have been doing to it is now showing up in these erratic events that are happening all around the world. Leadership to me means never to lose sight of the fact that the issues at hand are so much bigger than oneself. And leadership is about working from a principled and ethical place within oneself. And it is to model authentically and genuinely for others a sense of calm, a sense of clarity, and a sense of focus. And leadership is to always check inwards to ensure one is leading from a position of strength, not fear or victimhood. So one does not project one's own limitations onto those you're modeling possibilities for. So I leave you with that. And I thank you for this opportunity for all of us to come together today. And I think there are people from many other parts of the world who are listening in as well. And again, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sheila. Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much. I think that all of these awards serve to strengthen your voice so more people can hear. And I think that's what we look for. Okay, so isn't that fantastic? Great insights, super insights. Okay, so we're on to our next speaker, and it's Rod Jeffries, and I believe he's on the line. And just a little bit about Rod. He is an international speaker also and a trainer, and he's presented all over the world, Australia, New Zealand, USA, Europe. Over the last 25 years, his efforts have focused on the development and delivery of programs and staff for working with survivors of trauma, cultural oppression, sexual abuse, residential and boarding schools. And in recent years, Rod has become well known for his work on trauma, shame, and lateral violence across Canada and New Zealand. He's also the chairperson of the International Indigenous Council for Healing Our Spirit Worldwide. And his involvement began in 1991, prior to the first gathering in Edmonton, Alberta in 1992. He still is involved today, and the next gathering, put it on your calendar, is Vancouver in 2023. So just a few more words here. In the past 8 years, he's concentrated on developing trauma-based addictions programs to assist communities in their healing initiatives. He has recently developed facilitator training programs on lateral violence and healing trauma to share his messages and techniques for Indigenous people to rebuild these systems in today's world. So with that, I'd like to welcome Rod Jeffries. Good afternoon, Rod.
Hi, Sharon.
And I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Sharon, for the introduction. Also, thank you to the summit for inviting me to speak with you based on my experience working with trauma and mental wellness across the country as well as in other countries. You know, it's interesting that as I give this talk to you, I'm in northern Saskatchewan right now, dealing with a community or working with a community around trauma, lateral violence, and other issues related. And just to say right off the top that in working with this community, that the impacts of trauma and colonization have increased dramatically since the pandemic began. And so many of our communities across the country, I believe, are struggling with what's occurring now in our communities as a result of not only the pandemic, but also the last 300 years of colonization and ongoing trauma that does occur. And so I'm going to be sharing with you some of the information that I've learned over the years around mental wellness, around what's going on in our communities for the most part, and it will vary from community to community, but also being able to share with you some information in terms of the Indigenous experience with past pandemics. And so that's where I am going to start with you on that piece. So when you think about our experience with pandemics or epidemics, as Indigenous peoples of this land, of Turtle Island, we have, the first epidemic we experienced was back when Europeans first made contact with us. And so it's interesting to note that we here on Turtle Island did not have the antibodies to fight foreign diseases. And so in many of our communities, there are records around where maybe half of our population died because of foreign diseases. And I believe in the case of a couple of instances, total communities were wiped out. And so when we begin to look at the fabric of our communities and the roles different people took in our communities and the healing that was required as a result of the epidemics, that wasn't always possible because a lot of our medicine people, our healers may have passed away due to the epidemics. And so what we learned to do is to stuff the grief or repress the grief, and as a means of survival. And so our mental well-being was impacted shortly after contact because we weren't able to practice a lot of our customs and rituals and ceremonies that helped us get through the grief. And that's one thing we need to be able to really understand. The next line. And so when we think about epidemics, including smallpox, typhus, cholera, influenza, measles, yellow fever, and tuberculosis, that all of these diseases really struck at our people. And of course, as you can see, upwards of 93% of Indigenous peoples died from epidemics, depending on location and depending on the disease. So we have a long history and a long dark history with epidemics. Next slide. The impacts of previous history with disease and epidemics and trauma include the following responses to current epidemics or pandemics. So a lot of fear of illness and disease. And one of the things that occurs too, because of the colonization and trauma and very limited health services that we're able to access, that many of our people, because of the trauma and the impacts of trauma, become non-compliant around illnesses and disease. And of course, along with that too, because of the immense amount of losses we've experienced in the past in our communities, there's a lot of unresolved grief and loss issues that impact the total fabric of the community. One of the other impacts is intergenerational trauma. And of course, Sheila mentioned the recovery and or discovery initially of the 215 children at the Kamloops Residential School. And so many of us have experienced the intergenerational trauma as a result of residential school. So for example, both of my parents went went to residential school. And what they learned about themselves, they passed on to their children, myself and my siblings. And so that intergenerational trauma really impacted my family. And so we've had to be able to work through a lot of those issues that were passed on intergenerationally. And to this day, I continue to work on those issues so that I don't pass it on to future generations. So intergenerational trauma is huge, and we need to be very much aware of how that gets passed on from generation to generation. One of the big issues, and I think probably all of you might be aware of this, is because of the colonization and the oppression, and of course, as stated in the Missing and Murdered Women, Indian and Girls Commission report, the genocide that's occurred in this country is huge. So as a result of our experience, there's a huge distrust of government. Even though we've put it out there, we want to work with government, there's still a big distrust of government. And so I believe what happened with the current pandemic is, I believe that communities responded to the pandemic differently. So many of our communities know the history around epidemics and how epidemics attacked us. And so did everything they possibly could to protect their people. Everything they possibly could. And so, but then there were also other communities who have a huge distrust of government that did not want to follow government guidelines around the pandemic. And so there was a combination of both within Indigenous communities across the country. Another impact of diseases or epidemics and trauma was anxiety. So a lot of our people experience anxiety, along with anxiety, a lot of depression as well, which is brought on by past trauma, including efforts at forcing us to assimilate. So there is a lot of anxiety, and there has been a lot of anxiety in our communities around COVID-19. And the piece that we need to be able to look at, which this very summit is around, is the eco pandemic, in terms of what's happening to the mental well-being of our people as a result of past trauma, past colonization, past genocide, and how is that increasing our numbers in terms of people struggling with their mental well-being. Stress is a huge one. And of course, you know, when I think about our people, and when I think about how connected we were in the past and how much trauma has destroyed the connection and how disconnected we have become as a people. And then we add the isolation as a result of the pandemic, that we became even more disconnected, and which increased our issues around mental well-being. And so there's been a lot of stress as a result. The one thing I also want to say around stress is most of our communities have a very active health center. We may not provide all the services necessary to work with our people, but we do have very active health centers. I've worked with a few health centers in the past year, helping them work through the stress they experienced as a result of the pandemic. And many health center staff have had to take time off because of the stress they experienced trying to keep their people safe. So the stress has been huge. And of course, a lot of the stress is around fear of losing loved ones as well. And many of our people did lose loved ones. And of course, part of the process too, because of the pandemic, weren't able to either attend funerals or have a celebration of life, to be able to say whatever needed to be said as their loved one was being celebrated for the life they lived here on Mother Earth. So a lot of fear of losing loved ones, and the fear of losing loved ones continues today, because I keep seeing that how many people are being hospitalized because of COVID-19. one of the things that we saw as a result of the pandemic was an increase in substance use or abuse. I want to tell you the story about what happened with one community I've worked with on the West Coast. Their community is, excuse me, is surrounded by water. On three sides, it's the ocean. On one side, it's a river. And in keeping their people safe, they were really monitoring who was coming onto the reserve and who was leaving. And they did not permit anybody to leave for fear that they might catch COVID and bring it back to the community. So what people that were practicing alcoholics were doing, they would swim across the river to get more alcohol or drugs. And the people in the community were very concerned that they would lose people through drowning because of what was happening. And so what this community did was established one of the first managed alcohol programs in the country to be able to bring the alcohol into the community to help people manage their intake of alcohol, but also too to keep them safe. And so the managed alcohol program has really spread to various communities as a way, as a form of intervention. And then, of course, as we know, as many of you do know today, that we know underneath the alcohol are underlying issues, most often related to trauma. And so with the pandemic coming on and everything that we experienced as a result of the pandemic, whether it be isolation, loss of loved ones, just increase some of the impacts of some of the original traumas. And so that's why there was an increase in substance use or abuse. In many cases, we see an over-reliance on Western medicine. Prior to contact, we had our own health institutions, we had our own medicines, and our medicines were on the land. And a lot of our medicines were related to our ceremonies, our customs and rituals that helped us deal with some of our health issues. And as a result of colonization, and as a result of how we've been pushed to be ashamed of who we are and ashamed of our culture, many of our people now have an over-reliance on Western medicine. And what we're finding, especially in the area of mental wellness, is a lot of the Western medicine is used to band-aid mental wellness issues as opposed to deal with the source of mental wellness issues. And so there is an over-reliance on Western medicine in that area. There's an increase in domestic violence due to isolation and stress. And so in all the communities I've worked with in the last year, they all talk about how there has been an increase in domestic violence due to the stress, due to ongoing trauma, due to the ongoing impacts of trauma, and now again, due to the isolation. So domestic violence is on the rise. As I mentioned earlier, because of the trauma and the impacts of trauma, particularly around worthlessness, that there's non-compliance with health needs. And so, for example, where we have diabetics not eating properly or exercising to the extent they need to exercise, and not taking their insulin shots and so on and so forth. And so their health continues to get worse because of the non-compliance, which has its roots in unresolved trauma issues. This next line is a big issue with a lot of our people. We're more susceptible to infection, and where that comes from is a low-level immune system that's brought on by previous traumas. So there's been research related to what trauma does to our bodies and how it impacts our immune system, and how we're more susceptible to disease and infection. And so I believe that's why maybe our numbers in terms of COVID-19 were higher, which again placed more stress and more trauma on many of our people. And so we need to be able to look and be able to resolve some of those early issues of trauma, and many of which were related to residential schools. So when we look at epidemics today, so I'm going to start right out saying, with the institutional or systemic racism has resulted in less than adequate health services or funding for Indigenous peoples and all of our communities. And of course, as we know, there have been a couple of studies in at least 2 provinces that I'm aware of, where the outcome of the studies were how large racism is in the hospital and healthcare environments. And so what that does, it prevents a lot of our people from accessing off-reserve healthcare systems because of the racism, because of the institutional or systemic racism, but also too, that our funding is much less in our communities because of the racism, because of the institutional racism. In terms of what happened today, what I saw happening, and it was reported a few times from colleagues of mine, but also on the news, is where when Indigenous people tried to protect their communities from COVID-19, more racism occurred. Or when there was an outbreak in a certain Indigenous community, more racism occurred. And so what we need to be able to look at is, what can we do to address the racism? And not just as Indigenous peoples, but what does this whole country need to do to address the racism that's alive and well in this country? In terms of COVID-19, there's been a huge fear of losing more elders and the teachings and language the elders hold. And I know in many of the communities that I work with, and many other communities, we've lost many elders because, as all of you know, elders were the most at risk in terms of COVID-19, particularly before the vaccine came along. And so there was a huge fear in losing a lot of our history, losing a part of who we are as a people. And so we've got to be able to recognize a lot of the fear that we have had and continue to have, because COVID is still ongoing. So because of the many losses, because of the pandemic, because of what we've experienced, whether it's increase in mental wellness issues, an increase of people acting out their traumas, that many of our people are being triggered and respond with acting out behavior. So the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response to being triggered. And so when we get triggered, one of the things that's normal for a person to do is to make those uncomfortable feelings go away, because that's what gets triggered, is those uncomfortable feelings that are related to the original trauma. And so this is where the increase in mental wellness issues occurs, through the acting out behavior, whether it's an increase in substance abuse, whether it's an increase in violence, whether it's an increase in further isolation, and so on and so forth. And so we need to be aware of how COVID-19 has triggered many of us to act out our unresolved traumas. Because of our crowded housing issues, and of course, many of you have heard that housing is a really big issue, where we might have 15, 20 people living in a 2-bedroom house, and they may not have adequate running water or sewer systems, or the house is inadequately insulated. So we have, and in many of our homes in our communities, mold is an issue. So we need to be able to understand that the unhealthy living environments, due to disempowered communities, due to colonized communities, puts Indigenous people at a higher risk of being infected. And we need to be able to understand that. Isolated communities are at a greater risk to epidemics due to lack of testing, lack of health services, and distance to travel to adequate health services. So when you think about the communities that are isolated to the point of where if a patient needs to go to a hospital, they need to be flown out. And so we're at a greater risk because there are limited emergency flights to many of our communities. And then even though we may have to travel out to adequate health services, we may face racism once we get there. So many of the people that, say, for example, had to be transported to Thunder Bay, and of course we know what's happened in Thunder Bay in recent years around the level of racism that's directed at Indigenous peoples in that city. And so there's a lot of fear of using hospitals in the South because of the racism that does exist there. Social fear can lead to further isolation and lateral violence within the community. And so those of you that are unaware of what lateral violence is, lateral violence occurs when an oppressed group of people over a period of time begin to hurt and harm their own people. So it's around attacking our own people because of the colonization, because of the oppression, because of the genocide. And we've learned over the years that if we try and give that oppression back, the oppression most often gets worse from the oppressor. And so that can lead to a lot of social fear and a lot of blame on each other in our communities. So blaming the health center for the increase in COVID numbers, rather than blaming the lack of resources, the lack of funding, and so on and so forth. The isolation in our community leads to more disconnection and mental wellness issues as a result of the traumatic impacts of the pandemic. And so as a people, we were highly connected prior to contact. And with the trauma and the colonization and every act of trauma as a result of colonization have really disconnected us as a people. But what I will say, in building on what Sheila talked about, that even though we may be disconnected from each other, we are still strongly connected to the land, to the water, to basically all of creation. The trauma has caused us to be disconnected from each other. And so what we see as being able to move forward is to be able to do the work to connect with, number one, self, and number two, to connect to each other. So this next piece is around addressing some of the issues to move forward. So one of the big issues, and I mentioned it briefly, was to address the racism that exists in healthcare environments, whether the healthcare is around physical health or mental health. We need to be able to address the racism that exists. Otherwise, our people will continue not to use the resources outside of our communities. Resources are required to deal with the increase in health and mental wellness issues, including violence, depression, and anxiety, and I'm going to say an increase in substance abuse and many other issues. So, for example, in the community I currently am in, there's been an increase in murder, there's been an increase in suicide, there's an increase in violence, there's an increase in gang violence in the last 2 years. And so additional resources are required to deal with these. Just the other day, and I think it might have been yesterday, I read part of I think it's the Auditor General's report on the funding to Indigenous communities. And what the Auditor General stated was that if government was to invest in prevention and providing infrastructure, that the costs would be 2/3 less as opposed to dealing with issues after they've happened. And this is an important piece to look at, because our funding seems to be based on government's reaction to the emergencies that we experience in our communities, when if we were provided with the resources to be able to deal with issues as prevention as opposed to reaction. So we really need to look at resources to deal with the issues now, not when it becomes too late. And of course, as we know what happened in one community here in Saskatchewan in early September. And I believe that was a result of mental wellness issues and not having the resources to adequately deal with mental wellness issues in that community. The next point is around homelessness, and I think this may go for across the whole country, but we see it particularly in our communities where homelessness has at least doubled in many communities as a result of the pandemic. And so when we look at an increase in homelessness, there's going to be an increase in mental wellness. And of course, we know part of the homelessness is related to the poor housing or the lack of housing in many of our communities. And so what can we do to address the housing initiative or the lack of housing and the homelessness? And much of homelessness is again rooted in mental wellness issues, and it's rooted in trauma as well. We also need to look at having the resources to deal with the increase of substance abuse in many communities. And not only is there an increase in substance abuse, but there's been an increase in trauma in many of the communities as well. And so having those resources to begin dealing with those issues. The one thing I'm going to speak to, as we all know, residential schools existed in this country for at least 150 years. When the Aboriginal Healing Foundation was established, I believe in 1998, and the foundation was given $350 million to fund healing projects across the country. But it was expected for us to deal with those issues in 12 years. So, when we look at that issue, in many respects, it set us up to fail. Yes, there were many successes, but many people had to stop their therapy because there was no funding. And so we need to be able to have adequate long-term resources to be able to deal with all the issues that our communities are facing around mental wellness as a result of colonization, as a result of the trauma that came from colonization. And of course, now as a result of the impacts of the pandemic. We need to work at creating a trusting relationship with the healthcare system, but it's just not the work of Indigenous people. Quite often we talk about reconciliation, and many people feel it's the job of Indigenous peoples to reconcile, but no, it's the opposite. Reconciliation needs to happen by everybody. And so those people that work within hospital environments need to be able to address the racism that occurs, or address the discrimination, address the institutional racism or the systemic racism. And so that's the first step. And so when we can begin to see, for example, a hospital addressing the racism internally, that's a beginning. Just a small beginning of establishing a trusting relationship. A few years ago, I had the opportunity to work with a couple agencies on Vancouver Island, and the major focus was working with the local hospital so that they would treat elders from a place of respect. So they would treat elders from a trauma-informed perspective. When elders came into say the emergency room or came into the hospital. And so this is, and the hospital there was very much on board to working with the local communities to develop some protocols to be able to treat elders in a very respectful way. And so that initiative on its own began, there was some trust created there, although it may have been a wary trust, but it was the beginning of a trusting relationship. And so we need to be able to work toward building that trusting relationship. As Sheila talked about, she talked about on the land wellness programming or culture-based programming. And I believe that the programs that are being developed today are culture-based. Many of them are on the land programming because of our strong connection to the land and everything that the land represents for us. And so we need to be able to obtain resources so that we can carry out on the land programming and to do the trauma work out on the land, to be able to address and heal the traumas while we're on the land. And this piece is really important for us, that we're able to deliver programming based on who we are as a people, based on what matters to us as a people. And, you know, for too long, we were forced to do things by the Western system. And a lot of that did not work for us. And so we need to be able to address our issues based on who we are as a people. We need to be able to address the inequities between our communities, the Indigenous communities, and the general Canadian public institutions. There are many, many inequities, and of course, health is a big one. And even when we look at education, when we look at justice, when we look at policing, there are so many inequities that need to be addressed. And this needs to be part of the reconciliation process. And it's not up to us to reconcile. It's up to the mainstream. It's up to the federal and provincial governments to be able to ensure there's equity between Indigenous communities and non-Indigenous communities. Part of that process is also addressing the housing issues in most Indigenous communities, but also the water and sewer issues that exist in many Indigenous communities. So in terms of my community, I live at home, Tyinaniga Mohawk territory, 2 hours east of Toronto. On Lake Ontario, and of course we're only two and a half hours from Ottawa. You know, in the last 2 years, we have just got a water treatment plant. Many of us were under a boil water advisory for years, and when you think of where we're located, and all the water issues we've had over the years, and we have just got our water treatment plant, but not everybody in our community has access yet. In fact, where I live, we do not have access to water. So our water needs to be tested regularly, and it comes back as under a boil water advisory. But also too, you know, addressing the housing issues that exist in most Indigenous communities is really, really important. A lot of our people live in overcrowded conditions, in houses that are moldy, et cetera, et cetera. We need to address the poverty that can and does lead to mental wellness issues. And, you know, in many of our communities, because poverty has been going on for such a long time, it's become normalized. But poverty itself can be a trauma. And so addressing the poverty, and I was having a conversation this morning with a couple of health center staff here in this community, and they talked about their low wages. And when they talked about their wages, their wages are below the poverty line. And so this is one area where we need to look at equity in terms of salaries, so that when we work in our communities, that our salaries are equal to what's paid to people off reserve. And but you know, when we're kept in that place of dependence and we want to stay at home, we want to work at home, that poverty can be the result. And we need to be able to address that issue. Our focus needs to be on prevention of mental wellness issues. You know, for too long, we've been placed in that reactionary place. We're always reacting to what's going on in our communities. We need to be able to have the time and the resources, both financial and human resources, to deal with the mental, to have a prevention programs in place to prevent a lot of the mental wellness issues that are coming up. I know there are many communities that have been able to establish healing centers and healing programs, whether it be on the land programs or whether they have a residential program in their community. And you know, the healing programs work when it's done from our perspective as Indigenous peoples, when it's based on our culture. And so our prevention programs need to be exactly the same, where the prevention of mental wellness issues need to be done from our cultural foundation. That's really, really key. You know, as a result of colonization and trauma, that many of us do not know who we are. We've lost our identity. And of course, a lot of that began in the residential schools when it was beaten out of us, when language was beaten out of us. And so we need to be able to really focus on working with mental wellness issues, but also on the prevention of mental wellness issues. And now is a key time to prevent the echo pandemic from growing. We need to look at providing support systems developed for grief and loss issues, and particularly grief and loss issues that occurred because of COVID-19. You know, many communities lost loved ones and were unable to attend or provide a celebration of life. And so many people feel that they weren't able to say goodbye to their loved ones because they weren't able to attend a funeral, or there was no funeral and there was no celebration of life. And so this is a key point, is to develop these support systems. We need to look at ongoing healing and recovery efforts on trauma and intergenerational trauma that would include all the assimilation attacks we've had. It would also include what we experienced as a result of the pandemic. And our ongoing healing efforts need to be supported. And, you know, particularly the ones from past traumas that are related to colonization. So looking at what we've experienced because of residential schools, what we've experienced because of the 60s coup, what we've experienced because of the ongoing issues related to the child welfare system. And so having these ongoing healing and recovery efforts will minimize the impact of the echo pandemic in our communities. I believe that was the last slide. So in closing, what I would just like to say is that we need to understand what has occurred with Indigenous peoples over the last 300 years. We need to understand that the healthcare system has not been our friend. We need to understand a lot of the resources external to our communities have not been our friend. We really need to act in the spirit of well-being. We need to be able to move forward, walking together in terms of reconciliation. You know, yes, we are resilient people, but because we are resilient people doesn't mean we need minimal resources because we are so resilient, because we do have the strength to move forward. But We do need support. We do need resources in our communities to prevent the echo pandemic. So thank you for the opportunity to be able to share a few of my experiences with you. And I look forward to responding to any questions you may have.
Thank you, Rod. That was excellent. Okay, so we've got some Q&As here, questions, sorry. You talked about the challenges for people who deliver mental health services and care that have been exacerbated by the pandemic. Do you have any thoughts on how to support frontline workers in the communities you work with as we continue to move through this pandemic?
Okay, you know, the first thing I'll say is we need to be able to assist frontline workers manage their stress. You know, so many of our frontline workers are so concerned about the health and well-being of their people, they forget about themselves, which again is one of the impacts of trauma and shame. So to be able to put a system in place to be able to support people that are working the front line. And you know, I know many people work long hours in terms of the pandemic, and many have burnt out or on the verge of burning out, and also too with that became an increase in maybe some of their own mental well-being issues. So putting a strong support system in place to be able to help people debrief, because this last 2 years or 2.5 years now has been one huge critical incident. What are we doing to debrief the critical incident that's been going for 2.5 years to help people move through it in a healthy way?
Thank you, Rod. With the just further on that one, what kind of recommendations would you give to an individual frontline worker who doesn't have access to any support systems at this time? What can they do for themselves?
Well, you know, I just talked about this with the people I'm working with up here. And of course, we talked about self-care and being able to look after yourself mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually. And I believe one of the biggest forms of self-care we can do for ourselves is based on who we are as a people. So spending time on the land, going to ceremony, and putting people in place. And it's what I call a circle of care. And so a circle of care is where I would have people pick 3 people that can hold them accountable for caring for themselves. And so, Sharon, if you were in my circle of care, you might say to me, hey, Rod, you look really stressed out. You look really tired. What are you doing to look after yourself? You know, we get so busy that we forget about self-care. So, but if we've got a circle of care working with us to be able to say, hey, Rod, you better take some time off. Or you better go attend a ceremony. Rod, have you been smudging every day? And so on and so forth. So a circle of care can be very, very helpful.
Okay, thank you, Rod. Okay, here's another one. The perspectives that you shared of the implications for the pandemic on Indigenous elders should be terribly distressing for all of us. Can you speak to any unique considerations for how to support elders in this echo pandemic, and what communities have been doing to support their elders?
You know, in many ways, our elders, many of our elders hold who we are as a people. And so our elders can be viewed as very, very valuable in terms of the knowledge they hold. And so what we need to be able to do is to provide extra services to our elders, but also services too that will help our elders connect. And yes, we're still dealing with the pandemic, that we need to, and one of the big things that I've heard from elders is that elders have got really, really lonely because of the isolation. And in order for people to thrive, we need to connect to other people. And so having programs where elders can gather in a safe way, having extra resources to help get elders out will assist, but also helping elders with their own health issues as well, whether the health issues be related to mental well-being or whether it be physical health as well. So we need to be able to up our resources to be able to help elders walk through this pandemic in a good way.
Okay, thank you. One more question and then we'll have to move to the next speaker. But the question is, how do we convince decision makers to focus resources to prevention and infrastructure rather than being reactive?
Well, you know, I wish there was an easy answer to that question, but you know, I mean, in terms of the Auditor General's report, I mean, it was really clear, and I'm trying to recall some of the figures that she came out with. I think government's reaction cost 600 and some million, and had they provided funding in terms of prevention and infrastructure, the cost was around 200 million. So the cost tripled. And I think that in itself, I mean, if we can't convince them based on those numbers, it's game over. And so, I mean, those numbers speak for themselves. And I don't know what else, I mean, other than getting violent, I don't know what else to do.
Let's not get violent.
No, but you know, at the same time, it's so frustrating because we know that if this was funded as prevention, it would cost X amount of dollars, but waiting until it's too late is going to triple the cost. It's frustrating at the best of times. And so I think if we keep talking prevention, if we keep talking infrastructure that's necessary so that bigger issues don't result, and sometimes it takes more than just our voice. And so if institutions outside of Indigenous communities can also speak, say, hey, this is what Indigenous communities need to prevent this and this and this, that the more voices we have, I think the better off we will be.
Absolutely. And I think that follows on with some of the comments by some of the patients that patients and patient allies that we've talked to yesterday. And this talking about marketing and more communication and education for all, I think
Yes.
really kind of speaks to what you're saying.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'd like to thank you very much. As you know, this is being taped, so you will have access to that later.
Okay. Okay.
But again, thank you very much for coming.
Okay. And thank you, Sharon, for inviting me. And again, a final invite to Healing Our Spirit Worldwide, Vancouver, 2023, September 11th to 15th, where Indigenous wellness programs will be showcased. Now
Excellent.
for this opportunity.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, you can stay around or sign out, whatever you can do.
I have to get back to my workshop.
Oh, okay. Okay, well, we'll move on then. So have a great day and a great workshop.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay, so now we're moving on to our next speaker, and our next speaker is Deawidro Morrow. She will tell you a bit about herself, but before she starts, I would like to just say a few words. She is a registered dietitian working in her home community of Six Nations of the Grand, which is a real important aspect of the work that she's involved in. She's also the chair of the Aboriginal Nutrition Network of Dietitians in Canada and is one of less than 30 Indigenous dietitians across Canada. So Terry has been involved in health and social research development since 2010 with Western University, Northern Ontario School of Medicine, and University of Ottawa. She specializes in Haudenosaunee foods and water protection. So without further ado, I'll pass it on to Terry. Welcome, Terry.
Okay, scano de yoijo niwak senode matahioni niwak shoutde gaikono niwak wenzede agagweni. My name is Terry Morimo. I'm a registered dietitian from Six Nations of the Grand River. I'm also one of the chairs of the Indigenous Nutritional Knowledge Network of Dietitians of Canada. And so I'm really grateful to be speaking and sharing today at the Patient Summit here. We've had some wonderful conversations and connections with you know, the coordinators of this this project here. So I'm really happy to be sharing and connecting with you all. The name of my presentation today is called Netogan Yonto Kobanikoha, and in my Gaikono or Cayuga language and nation, that's how we would say, so be it in our minds. And that's really a way to bring us all together and to connect our minds as one. And I am a sole proprietor of my business called Ongwayat Tatogesto, which is a health and nutrition and cultural program run here on Six Nations of the Grand River. I am the only Cayuga dietitian from Six Nations. So the language and the knowledge and the cultural teachings that I share at this point are pretty unique. I've had some amazing teachers and knowledge keepers that have been able to share with me along the way. So I'm really grateful. And again, to be here sharing with you and any, you know, knowledge that can be shared with me, I'm always open for that as well. So again, I'm giving you a perspective today from a Haudenosaunee registered dietitian. As I mentioned, Gaikono, I'm Cayuga from the Cayuga Nation on Six Nations of the Grand River. So often we get lumped together because we are Six Nations. But each one of our nations has our own culture, identity, and language. So that is from time immemorial. So as far back as we can remember, and we're going back literally thousands of years here. We're not talking about, you know, 150, anything like that. You know, it's quite immature when it looks at, you know, the lifespan of our people here on Turtle Island, and especially, you know, in the Six Nations of the Grand River area, but the nation connection in itself, how our nations have worked together. You know, collective responsibility doesn't absolve individuality or individual nation responsibility either. So that's a very important point to share about our food systems, and you know, from what my perspective is as a registered dietitian working in the healthcare field. So something that we do start with, you know, to bring our minds together, to bring kind of, you have to think about everything that language offers, you know, those tones, those vibrations, those energies that are emitted when language is being shared. And again, with our Cayuga language, our Gaikono language, that's something that is it's within us, right? When we sing to our seeds, when we speak to creation, when we speak to animals and plants, and our children, speaking in this way is passing on an ancient vibration and energy to those things that recognize it, you know, especially spirit. You know, spirit really does recognize those vibrations. So what we traditionally do as Haudenosaunee is to do what's called the Deoi Waro Getto Denohanyo. And this is a way for us to offer acknowledgement to everything that supports and surrounds our minds, body, and our spirit, right? The energies that are around us that help to uplift us and help to carry us through difficult times, you know, really good times. We are mindful of that. So it's kind of in English, it's given a Thanksgiving speech, but really it's about being humble and honored and acknowledging everything around you that helps to support you as a Ongwe person or a Haudenosaunee person or a Gaikono person. So first we give thanks to the Creator. Nanda ni gan go den aswada hausios kani white go hawado. Nay hand by hand can't to saboyadiso songwawi gano hanyok. Nay al fui scano bueno donio. Nay and dwehake ya Scott edwayant ogwatni goha. Scott de dwatanahonio. Into ganyo top ogwatni goha. And then we talk about our mother. Dane and Watro we set a Wednesday. De dwanoha de dwanokwa. Dwanoha de dwanokwa. Ne guato se nieha. Ne and dwehe guego. De dwanahonio. Ne tuganyo toko guatni goha. And then those that have been, given that task to uplift us in that way. Dane and Watrowi, how hage galhire hanal grace boy diso. Nate so to sento, Nate scano, Edwino donio, Nate di ne and dwehe, they said wanahonio, galhire hanal grace boy diso. Nate ganyo toko bani goha. Dani Tony got Guini, Ige, Agaya Gifta, Ganohanyo, Dani To. So that's how we would end the talk of bringing our minds together. And again, the way that I explained this discussion today and this Thanksgiving today was very, I would say, like a very basic, like almost like a kindergartner type language translation. Because people in our communities that really do hold high knowledge and high, language words can speak to giving thanks sometimes for, a half hour, 45 minutes, hours, days. It really depends on the individual and who and what they actually carry as far as their knowledge set. So again, mine is just something that was given to us as beginner learners that we could kind of build off of. So that's the goal for me as a language learner. I do study Gayakono or Cuba language here on Six Nations. And studying the language has provided me with an opportunity to, I'm not a language speaker. I don't have language speakers in my family either. So doing this and having goals set out to give thanks and be mindful and be, humble and respectful in that way of these words is a really good goal for me to set. That's something that I can pass on to my children and to, really carry inside of me. So I'm really thankful to be able to do that. From this type of oral type space, I think that, a lot of these discussions that we're having around food sovereignty and Indigenous food spaces and systems, for me as a Haudenosaunee dietitian, really does center from the foundation of what was just shared there, being mindful of creation, of spirit, of self, and then others in the space as well, that can uplift our minds and our way. So that for me is really important to incorporate into anything in a food space, because it helps set my mind to help carry a responsibility around food and water and medicine. And those things, for my organization called Ongwayat Datogesto, that's really what that it means in Cuga language, is that it helps to uplift our bodies or helps us to align our bodies. Food, water, and medicine. And medicine isn't really the sense of like a Western type medicine. It's a medicine of like spirit and a medicine of kind of what can uplift us and help bring those mind and body together and spirit together in that way. So that's medicine for us in a way. Our language, our songs, our seeds, all those responsibilities. So I have a master's degree from McMaster University, and in that degree, I was, fortunate enough to be able to create an oral, I guess, thesis. And the project that I created was called Water Stories. And I created it with a local organization through the Red Door here on Six Nations. It's a media, a multimedia company. They do many things. But really what I wanted to acknowledge was the different water sources that actually fed into the life and the development of our life here at Six Nations of the Grand River. So I went to a few different spaces that had water sources around Six Nations to help to tell their story. So I'll click it here and then change the screen to so you guys can see it as well. Here we go. So hopefully you're seeing what I'm seeing as far as the Water Stories website goes. So really what I did was try to put, again, a different connection to the waterways around Six Nations, about understanding just the standing water, the flowing water, the big waters, the small waters, all the waterways that are feeding into actually nourish the soil and the space here on Six Nations of the Grand River. And again, the space I'm talking about isn't just like what you see on, if you looked on a map, like the Google map or whatever, about where Six Nations lies. Like the space I'm talking about is really within the dish. What the dish kind of describes is, for us, these are agreements that have been put in place between, individuals, nations, plants, animals, all that understanding, again, that we talked about in that opening address or that Thanksgiving. We acknowledge it further with almost a protocol to responsibility, and that's within what's called wampum. And one of the very first slides that I've placed up there, you'll see that purple and white belt. It's made out of wampum from a quahog shell, and it has a representation for Haudenosaunee people to acknowledge really where and how and what we utilize in our food system and our sustenance. And that's again really important, because you have this job of being responsible and being humble and being mindful, all these things, and then these wampum can actually help to lay out the process or the protocol of how you're actually supposed to enact that and to take it into being. And I think the really important thing about the dish wampum is that, I've often heard in many academic circles, unfortunately, primarily academic circles. And again, whenever I hear something that I've heard knowledge people and, people with high language in our community or in our nation speak about, the dish, they talk about it in a way that is really, the dish is everything and anywhere that we need to be to get sustenance for ourselves. There is no boundaries or limitations on specifically where and how, and within Ontario or within, some other made up boundary after the fact, or even, on the land that we had reserved for our use. That's really what I think of. But when I do, and have worked in a lot of academic circles and research and as a dietitian, and a lot of people are unfortunately wrongly labeling it in whatever perspective they have in that sense. I think it really, in English, has always been termed the dish with one spoon. And I think the issue with acknowledging that teaching in that way is, primarily there is a line that's in the center of that larger circle or the dish. There is a line in there, but that line that's in there actually represents sustenance. Like I said, it's everything that sustains us as human beings. And people have said that, you know, sometimes, you know, people that translate it have said, you know, there's no sharp objects in there, or there's no, you know, not to have a knife or anything that could hurt or harm others in there. And I think some other thinking minds have taken that to believe that it means, well, if it's not like a knife, and it's not like we sat around with those types of utensils either, like when we think about when these things are actually made. So that perception that it's a spoon, again, there's a lot of, you know, questions with that. So that if that's a spoon, right, if we have a dish and a spoon, the dish is there for everybody's use is what the underlining factor of that is. And if the dish is there for everybody's use, and there's only one spoon in there, and you want to eat, somebody has to pick up that spoon, right? And whether it's like I picture like feeding my baby, or, you know, my kids, like I can eat and I can give them to eat, but I'm in control of that spoon. That's not what that agreement says. The agreement says we all have equal rights and share to what's in this dish, and we don't interfere with one another, and we won't bring anything sharp into this dish because we don't want to hurt or harm one another. So when we're speaking like that, we're not saying like, I get the spoon and then here I'll give it over to you and you get it. Like none of that is talked about in there, and that's not the underlining factor. So I believe, again, like, because I've only heard that in academic and people that don't have the high language that's in the community, that, you know, it is a very Western concept. If you hear people mentioning it as, you know, a dish with a spoon, because if there's a spoon in there, somebody has to have control of that spoon at one time, and that means the others don't. And that's not what we talk about. We talk about that dish with simple sustenance in there, and we all have access to it. So I just really wanted to drive that point home, because that's really how things get twisted and turned. Again, when people don't have that language, and they're only taking from, you know, some Western or English translation or perception of how that gets turned, because that there is no mention of a spoon being in there. And I understand that too, as just as I said, as if I would feed my baby, I have control over that spoon until I hand it over to my baby, right? So it's not like anybody else in there has control of a spoon at one time until they hand it over. That's not the idea or the concept that's written into that understanding, right? We all have access to it, and we all have a shared responsibility to it. And that's really what we're trying to talk about, again, when we attach that protocol or that process of how we actually become, you know, food sovereign, or take on responsibility about our Haudenosaunee or Indigenous type food system. So sharing that with you again, just, you know, understanding the supportive space that language and culture takes in understanding our food system and who we are as Haudenosaunee and Ongwehongwe, the original people of this land. On this website, I've created, again, different videos throughout the years with different knowledge keepers that can, some of these videos, this isn't my video with John Burroughs, he made that video himself, but he's very knowledgeable. But again, I've shown, you know, where this water sits, kind of the energy and the vibration that sits around it today. I've given the location. So these are all waterways that surround 6 nations. And again, our food and sustenance comes from anywhere that we need to be based on the dish wampum. This is a residential school, the Mushwell, one of the first residential schools in Canada and one of the longest running residential schools. It just closed in 1996. so that you understand, again, that's a long-term impact of really having kids and families connected to food and water, these waterways and such. So there's other places where, you know, medicines are picked. Those are all sprouted ferns, fiddleheads. This is the study in 2012 that I did with the First Nation Food, Nutrient, and Environment Study. And that study is the first of its kind below the 60th parallel that actually has a lot of community and participatory research done in it. So we actually, I trained people here and hired people here in Six Nations to collect water samples from the Grand River and from their homes so we could test them. We collected traditional food samples and hair samples for, you know, to analyze for different chemical analysis. And this is the toxicologist, Lori Chen, one of the principal investigators of the project. And I was a nutrition research coordinator for Ontario and East Coast to help collect that data. So there's a lot of good information and things on here. Again, this is, again, some wampum discussions from, like I said, a knowledge keeper and somebody that's very highly educated in who we are as Haudenosaunee. He speaks multiple Haudenosaunee languages and really is a, like if we had PhDs, he would have one in who we are as Ongohomi people, right? And again, somebody with that high knowledge and high ability, he actually describes, you know, the dish wampum in this video. So it'd be a great, you know, place to start to really understand from Haudenosaunee people about our food system, about our food ways, is to learn from our people. Yeah, so that's the website. And again, I mean, there's just a lot of foundational pieces that we have to understand the difference between what Indigenous is and what nation bases are represented. So this is a video that I wanted to show that was created here with another organization, Revitalizing Our Sustenance. Here is a youth program and project that has been running for a few years. My daughter has participated, and I have other family members that have participated as well. This was done here this year at my home when we planted in May, the corn in the backyard here. So it's really great partnership again between large organizations like Dietitians of Canada and grassroots organizations like my own and the knowledge keeper, Alex or Kido Hill, and his, you know, Haudenosaunee cultural teachings. He runs his own organization for that. And then again, the youth program. So the four of our organizations all work together to create a message, a shared message about the food systems and acknowledgement of nations. So that video there, again, was in a partnership sense and space. And I think it's a really good kind of foundation of what's to come and how, you know, we have that individual nation representation that, you know, Dietitians of Canada as a larger organization represents, you know, their acknowledgement of Indigenous land, Indigenous space. I think when we have, you know, over 2,000 dietitians working in the field of, you know, food and water, that's what we're all about, you know, and, you know, it's a good start of where we can go. So here, that's my presentation today, Trace Nyala. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope all of the video and all that stuff has worked out. And this is my email should anybody want to contact me further, and you can always contact me through the Patient Summit organizations as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Terry. That was a very informational session and very much appreciated. Really opened my eyes about a few things. So thank you very much for that. We do have a couple of questions in the chat, and let me see, where is it? Okay. Question 1: what did the Haudenosaunee food system look like during the COVID-19 pandemic when grocery stores had limited supplies?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think it really did open my eyes again to look at the field of dietetics itself. There's such a high political aspect to a lot of food choice. And walking into the grocery store locally around here, we don't have grocery stores on the reserves here. Typically, in Six Nations being one of the largest, we don't have a full functioning grocery store. There's food available in the corner or gas station stores that can be accessed, but at high cost, of course, and they're shelf stable typically, so not high nutrition and not fresh. So when I walked into the local grocery stores in the surrounding cities, the whole dairy section, the whole fresh fish space, those beautiful, wonderful, oils and fats were completely unavailable, and even in sometimes in the meat department as well, those were scarce. So that was always a little bit concerning that those things weren't available going into the grocery store. But again, I mean, within the community here ourselves, we have access to the foods and, the game and the fish that we've always had access to for thousands of years and for the hundreds of years that we've been living, in this space here along the Haldeman track. So we had, lamb's quarters. We had, it's a type of like wild spinach in a way. Like we had foods and things that could replace the calcium that we weren't able to get. We had access to fish as well as hunting, fiddleheads, wild leeks, wild strawberries. We had that all right outside of our door here. So very lucky to have those, knowledge keepers in the community and to have that as a part of my family structure to be able to do that. And I think that's really what the push has been since COVID, is that people just making themselves more aware of how they can access these foods on their own outside of that system, that political food system. Because you're going to get a lot of different varieties that give you a lot of different nutritional qualities, and you're gonna learn a lot and be able to share that with family and friends. So yeah, it looked good here on Six Nations, but again, when I looked at the perspective of, if you only had access to a grocery store, it was pretty poor and limited choices, unfortunately. But we flourished, and it was a really good thing to see, because we do hear and talk a lot about residential schools and the impact of how they've impacted our food system and our culture, but I can tell you that here in Six Nations we had access to that. Like my girlfriend and I were packaging up fiddleheads and distributing them to people that wanted to have them, and wild leeks, and it was really a beautiful time to showcase community and resiliency.
Awesome. That sounds like almost like an advantage, an opportunity.
Well, yeah, and that's what our people have passed on to us, right? I mean, we didn't survive on these lands here for thousands of years just heading over to the Zaires. Like we know what we need to sustain ourselves. We practice it in our ceremonies, and then it's within our language, our responsibilities, and it's the truth that we carry with us and pass on to our children. So yeah, it's definitely a story of resilience, which I'm very, very happy to share. So thank you for that question.
Excellent. There's another question here. What are the practice and policy opportunities to grow and sustain nation-based sovereign food systems across Turtle Island?
Right. Okay, that's a wonderful question. So the nation-based space, it really does come from, I guess, my work as a dietitian. So, and I'm also working as a researcher. So I did mention the First Nation Food, Nutrient, and Environment Study. So looking at that, I was lucky enough to work, on the East Coast and here in Ontario, and looking at the different, food sources for these different nations, and hearing the presentations from, Alaska and the different people that have already contributed into the summit so far. We understand that food is, it's cultural, but it's also geographical. Like the geography makes a big difference on what you have accessible and available to you. And we can't understand that fully when we continue to write into our research and into our policy and into our directives of how to support an quote Indigenous food system. So as a dietitian, I want to know, what do I feed the Seneca people, if I'm in Seneca territory? I cannot look at research that uses the word Indigenous, Aboriginal, and understand what is going to benefit these specific Seneca people. And that's the type of work and policy and in research that we need to be focusing on and building on. Each nation has its own representation. It is not Haudenosaunee and Cree as a whole, and it's not Indigenous as a whole. Each one of those nations has its own agreements and understanding with the federal, first and foremost, and then, the provincial and then municipal spaces that they connect into. So what happens in, let's say, New Credit or Oneida Nation is not going to affect anything that has to do with Six Nations of the Grand River. And that has to be how we talk about health and wellness, because you cannot expect a non-native or maybe even a Anishinaabe or a credit dietitian to be able to service a Cayuga client or family with knowledge that they're getting that just says Indigenous or Aboriginal, right? You have to be specific, because those foods, those songs, those ceremonies all come from those nations. Their languages are all different as well. So that's where it becomes really important that those conversations are removed from that umbrella type context. I think we've used that, and it's in policy and it's in a lot of reporting, only because it serves the purpose of that larger governing body. Typically, the needs that are in that paperwork are not specific to the nations that they're supposed to be helping, right? So I think that when we talk about policy, and that if your politicians aren't directly talking about specific nations, if they can't name in Ontario, here there's 133 plus nations that they should be mindful of, and each one should have its own representation when we're talking about how to service them well. It's that real. In Canada, there's over 650. It's that real. The word Indigenous and the word Aboriginal, those umbrella terms, do not service at the patient level. They don't. They service at the desk level and at the funding distribution, which is still very skewed, again, because we can't tell really what the Seneca people need over the Cayuga people. And until we can do that, we're not doing a service to real healthcare. And again, anything that happens with Indigenous people at any level is to support the greater population first and foremost. And from the first question that you asked me, it is quite clear. We had access to food when the Canadian population did not. Now, the Canadian population has to really take that in and understand that you're not helping Indigenous people when you make these moves. You're helping yourself. You're helping yourself to live in a better way, as your ancestors did when they first arrived here. Our people have been living here for thousands of years. So I hope that kind of helps a little bit.
Yes, it helps a lot. Thank you. One other thing, maybe you could say a little bit more about, you talk about the importance of language and, you know, that when we're looking at the things in a holistic way, what kind of things would be helpful in, I guess, for lack of a better way to say it, educating the youth away from like chips and pop?
Great. So I have been lucky enough again to bring youth here to my home. I have 2 acres of our Haudenosaunee Flint corn that I partner with a knowledge keeper, Sky's Corn, Bonnie Sky, in the community, that her family has been doing that, you know, for hundreds of years. And I've tapped into that as a dietitian. So that's the first, you know, if you don't know, you go to who know first and foremost, right? And then you work to bring in the youth to share and to engage in different ways. So the way I worked with the youth STEAM program, the Indigenous STEAM program, and asked them to come here because they can connect a lot of what happens in science and technology. You can connect a lot into, again, our culture. And when we talk about our culture, we're talking about, in Haudenosaunee territory, a cycle of ceremonies that surrounds in the language. And what you saw on there was, you know, how we've kind of, you know, spaced it out with the moons. So again, there's that science part in there, but it has to connect with them in that way, because I don't expect them never to touch pop and chips. But if I give them a little bit of value of cultural essence tied to food, it becomes their decision, because culture can stick with them and build them, and language longer than that bag of chips or that pop is going to in the end, you know. And I think that when they're afforded the opportunity to engage in teachings and lessons and opportunities like that, it does counterbalance with the typical nutritional talks that happen at the school level as well about, you know, eating well and, you know, but the hands-on part of it, so those come into like, this is what the choices that you make. So it's very logical in the classroom, but them actually having the hands-on experience here in the community, it helps them to carry that as a piece of them, as opposed to just something that has to sit as a decision in their logical mind. They actually touch the corn, they smell it, they're working with it, they're caring for it, they're, you know, taking the seeds, they're braiding. That gives it so much more value to them and building their skills and their confidence than just putting something in their mind. You're putting something in their heart in that way with language and culture. That's what we teach with our, because it's always a part of what we're talking about when we bring them here.
Awesome. That's excellent. There's also in the chat a link to the earlier pre-summit webinar. So if you have a chance, have a look at that. Highly recommended. So with that, I think we will thank Dea Widrow for her presentation. It was excellent as usual, and hope to see her again soon. And then we'll be moving on to the breakout sessions in just a few minutes. So maybe people can take a couple of minutes to have a quick stretch and a bathroom break, grab a drink, and then come on back. And don't hang up, right, Leah?
Don't hang.
Okay.
Don't hang up. We will. You will be automatically assigned to a breakout room. So just by all means, have a quick break, but come right back and participate in a conversation about, just to help digest the incredible information that's been shared with us today, and I would say wisdom. And I just want to, re-articulate Sharon's thanks, Deo, for a series of fantastic presentations. So deepest thanks to you.
Thank you both so much. Yes, it's been wonderful, very wonderful.